Good morning. This is Debra V. Wilson. It is the 31st of July, 2018, Tuesday. The time is 100 hours, 11 minutes, and that's GMT minus 6, and I'm in Winnipeg. I spend a lot of time in my podcast and my research trying to understand the ways in which civil society engage with national security modeling, and in particularly feminist civil society. That's women's civil society and women's civil society that defines itself as feminist. I guess that's more accurate to say women's civil society. And in looking at the dynamics between the two entities, collectively speaking, it's always interesting to have an understanding or garner an understanding of how the state constructs threats and what is actually a threat to national security. I've mentioned repeatedly that I'm in my 60s, my early 60s, and that's very important. Given the podcast I'm about endeavoring on, it's about the neighborhood I grew up in, which was called Woodlawn, on the south side of Chicago. Now, Woodlawn, part of Woodlawn houses the University of Chicago, and that's one part of Woodlawn. The part of Woodlawn that I lived in did not. My parents literally could not sell the house they owned, so we remained in Woodlawn. The neighborhood was under the control of a street gang called Black Peace Donation. It was headed by a man named Jeff Ford, and there were a lot of mass contradictions in the entire situation. For instance, there were targeted murders between the Disciples, that was a rival gang of Jeff Ford's, of Blackstone Rangers, also called Blackstone Rangers, Black Peace Donation, and the Blackstone Rangers. There were this constant fights between Black Peace Donation and my neighborhood. The headquarters was a block away from where I lived. And so there were always these rival, they were paramilitary groups, literally. And there was always this rivalry around the two groups that included murder. There were different times in the life of the gang still exists, but in the gang's heyday, there were literally times in which there were mass recruiting going on, and so they were recruiting young males, and if a young male had the misfortune of garnering their attention and he didn't want to join, it might mean that he would lose his life or be physically harmed and maimed. They killed the police, they targeted anybody that the gang felt was a threat. Ironically enough, though the gang was responsible for a lot of violence, the actual street I lived on had very little actual violence. It was residual violence. So Jeff Ford didn't like street crime, breaking and entering. He didn't like drug addicts in the neighborhood, although the Blackstone Rangers sold drugs. So we didn't have that. We also didn't have very many services from the city because they were afraid to come in, including things like the paramedics. We didn't have any decent grocery stores. My parents, because they were employed and had very good jobs, so we shopped at our grocery shopping outside of the neighborhood. So we didn't have regular convenience stores, very few, and they were mom and pop stores. Grocery stores, the one that existed in the neighborhood was horrific, and you could smell a rotten meat when you walked by the store, no exaggeration. On a regular basis, the street lights were shot out, the light. because of, well, for obvious reasons, they didn't want the street lit up. Uh, the Chicago Transit Authority, the drivers, it was predominantly a black neighborhood, probably 99.9999% African American. And the bus drivers that drove the buses that serviced the community, so I'm thinking about the 67th Street bus, the Stony Island bus, they did what they could do to facilitate those of us, because I never learned to drive. I don't know how to drive. So they would stop the bus between stops if that got you closer to your space, and they would do things like honk the horn to make sure the gangs knew a civilian was going through. The gangs were really good about knowing which families were civilians and outside the fray. The community always knew in advance if there was going to be an execution or if the disciples were going to come into the community. But that's right, we knew in advance if there was going to be murder. That's correct. And they would go to the faith leaders in the community and sometimes to the aldermen in the community and tell them that to keep people off the streets during certain periods of time, because they were hunting for someone for whatever reason. And the aldermen, the faith leaders, always told them to go to the police. That never happened. I've heard 2 murders, literally heard 2 people being murdered in my neighborhood. That's actually not unusual. In the community, Jeff made a deal with the faith leaders that they would keep their warring invisible and to a minimum on Sunday. Most people in the community were of Christian religious, from a Christian religious background, and there was a lot of expression of religiosity. So he tried his best, seriously, to keep the warring and the killing to the end of Saturday, very early Sunday morning. So by the time the people went to church, the churches, the small ones, storefront churches as well as the big traditional church building, you actually didn't see presence of the gang. He tried to do that. There were some pretty rigid gender narratives, binaries. So women, these men, they didn't tolerate homosexuality. These men had women partners, wives or domestic partners, and the women had to dress in a certain way to cover themselves. No quote-unquote lewd clothing. You couldn't date 2 men simultaneously. They were literally deemed as holes. Women that are females that stayed away from the gangs and you didn't try to involve yourself in the gangs. I don't want to paint a rosy picture, but Jeff he's still alive, he's in prison. Jeff had some pretty rigid and traditional constructs of gender. So there were narratives around good women and a hoe, bad women. And they stick to those, and those narratives about gender proliferated the gang, as well as narratives about what a good man was, with strong physical strength, being able to provide. You heard shooting at night. When I was growing up, and I left the south side of Chicago right before I turned 40. So one of the ways they celebrated New Year's Eve, New Year's, the 1st of January, was at the strike of midnight to shoot guns in the sky. And during the time that Jeff was there, we could hear the weapon power they had. It's supposed to go on for a minute. It went on sometimes as long as half an hour, but the shooting would trail off the longer it went. But anyway, you would hear the weapons they had. It was difficult to go out of your house or apartment late at night. It wasn't so much like it is now. Murder is murder, but there was less being caught in the crossfire, and they tried to keep their killings to gang members. And if someone in the Blackstone Rangers killed someone who was deemed an innocent, not involved in the gangs, or a woman not involved, in an elderly person or a child, and that would be 12 and under, because I think, and I might be wrong about this, I think they recruited. I know they recruited high school age boys, but I think which in that the area I lived in would be starting at 14 to 18 high school age, but I think they sometimes recruited 13-year-old boys. And recruit means reaching out to you, force you to join the gang. We didn't have simple things like pizza delivery because there are no delivery companies that would deliver. We didn't have any pizza places. We had Harold's Chicken at 67th and Stony Island, and that place appeared to be under protection. On Fridays after work, I would stop off and get chicken dinner, and you saw gang bangers in there, and that was that was an off-limits place. They didn't do shooting there. They didn't gang bang typically on the buses. Gang bang means hunting and potentially killing. We didn't have a pharmacy in the immediate area. We had whole spaces of vacant lots where buildings had been, and they raised the building because they didn't want it to be used as a place to store drugs. There was a yearly ritual of some of the killed people, murdered people were found in the Jackson Park Lagoon. Jackson Park was not too far from me, east of me. And when the springs thawed, the bodies would rise up to the top. So that's when the police found out about some other people that had been murdered. Like I said, you might hear gunshots. No convenience stores, no regular stores. The one shopping, grocery store of some substance and size. It was interesting. It was owned by people from the Middle East, and they, like an overseer, we didn't shop in the store, but I'd been in the store once to get some bread. My mom, I don't even think she realized I'd gone there to the store, but anyway, yeah, we did go in the store once or twice. My mother was NOI, Nation of Islam, and Nation of Islam always suggested to their members not to shop in these places. But in any case, it was owned by a Middle Eastern family, and one of them was in this. They had built this thing. It was like an overseer thing, and I bear witness to Allah on the Holy Quran. And there he was in it, like a basket type of thing. So he was looking down over all of us with a loaded rifle. A Middle Eastern family also owned the one liquor store in the neighborhood. So there was this narrative of where the Middle Eastern families that owned businesses in these impoverished communities had very derogatory narratives about their African American customer base, and the African American customer base had equally derogatory narratives about the foreign Arab families that owned businesses in quote unquote our communities, their communities. You sometimes hear police cars, maybe sometimes on a regular basis, screeching through the neighborhood. I grew up in a 3-story home. It was very large. The living room wasn't. Most people, we had little televisions in several rooms, and the big television was downstairs, and you would think that it would be in the living room. There was certainly space for it, but you couldn't put it in the living room because there were all these windows. So it was in the dining room up against, it was the corner of the dining room, and the chairs were, I'm not good at describing dimensions, were arranged in a way so we could watch TV at night and not get caught in a crossfire. when we heard shooting, I grew up, even though we were in this community, I grew up in a middle class family with all the accoutrements you would expect in a middle class family. My father taught us that when we heard gunshots, anything, it could even be a car backfiring, not to second guess, and how to drop and roll out of the bed, and not to lift your head up, to keep your head down, and crawl to a space that in which there was no exposure. The windows, you weren't exposed by the windows. Again, the crossfire. If a gang member accidentally shot or, God forbid, killed someone deemed an innocent, that could mean the end of the life of the gang member. At the very least, if the person was still alive but wounded, they literally were beaten to a pulp, and the family was given money for restitution. They wore uniforms. They had narratives of religiosity in later years around their construct, Blackstone Rangers, of black nationalism. You couldn't bring outsiders into the neighborhood. If you did, it was kind of good to let somebody know, like when we had family reunions, because we lived in this really big house. We always let somebody know so it got back that we were having family over. They were particularly concerned, Jeff Ford, about men coming in, because it could be the disciples, or it could be undercover cops. So you kind of wanted to let them know. I lived in a community in which people knew in advance, in some cases, that someone was going to be murdered. As I said, I heard 2 murders, constant gunfights. Young males were recruited and then taught how to kill, and they were often given the assignment to, the way you worked and got your stripes in the gang was to murder someone, and it was common knowledge. There was a man in the community with the nickname Ghost. His job was, he's dead now, his job was to recruit a young man, recruit in quotes, and if you didn't want to join and they wanted you desperately, then they murdered you, hence the name, or someone in your family, hence the name Ghost. I still, today and every day, question why that wasn't deemed as a national threat. But it wasn't. It was deemed as an inner city black people problem. Right. In London, England, I spent a lot of time looking at extremism. And my focus was as a civil society actor, understanding, and a feminist, and looking at ways in which feminists responded to national security modeling, and how is the state keeping us safe, and do we understand the ways in which the state keeps us safe, and why, and whether we thought it was working. But I looked at the violence that extremists espoused, and I never understood. I know it's 2 different countries, the UK and Chicago's in the US, but I never understood how and why gang violence is not considered a national threat, and why it's not terrorism, and why the recruitment of gang members isn't deemed as radicalization. I grew up with some young males that I saw recruited into the gangs and initiated into the gangs, and it was a process, but then I couldn't talk to them anymore. My parents wouldn't let me, because they were now Blackstone Rangers, and they were bragging about their first kill, or their first beat down, in which they'd beaten someone to a pulp. And I've known some of these boys, and we had this game in my old neighborhood where we'd run after balls, this big ball, and toss it around, and I played with these kids and as children, And now they had their first kill under their belt, and they were bragging about it. But the word radicalized is still to this day, even what we know about the process in which people are radicalized, young people, and extremism, we still don't call that extremism in the gangs, and we don't call that radicalization. I mean, unless we're supposed to believe that there's something about poor people in the inner city, poor black people in the inner city, that makes them prone to a psychopathy, then how do you explain a kid that 6 months ago was running around chasing balls, and his biggest goal was to catch the ball that was thrown in the air and race it to get it to the other side, and now he's bragging about his first kill? Okay? So unless you want to make that simple and easy for yourself and say that's a black thing or a poor black thing, I don't know. And how's that not a national threat? Isn't the greatest asset for any nation its people, its citizens? So why isn't that a threat to national security? One hears about the ever-increasing quote-unquote security at airports. There are a lot of poor people in the inner cities that will never make a leisure trip, vacation trip, anywhere. They just don't have the money to do it. So, but we still view securing an airport as a national interest. But it doesn't appear to be a national interest to secure and make communities in which people live safe. That's an inner city thing. That's a black thing or a brown thing in cities like Chicago. I was online doing some research, and I saw this History Channel documentary about Jeff Ford's Blackstone Rangers. It's pretty violent, it's pretty bleak, but it's familiar to me. There's a joke in my neighborhood, the people I grew up with, drop and roll. Literally, you heard a sound of a gun. It probably was a gun. If you think it sounds like a gun, it probably is a gun. So you drop and roll on the floor, and then you keep yourself down and crawl to a safe place. Just like in the military, one would imagine in armed service, doing an actual war. Because that's kind of what it's like. It was, and in some parts of Chicago still is. So I still continue to wonder and question. My suspicion is because the people who do national security model. That's part of it, and how we value what is national and what is of value to the nation and who is of value to the nation. That's my suspicion. The other thing is, I think most intelligence agencies don't look at the continuum that exists between street gangs and radicalized youth and some gender stuff, some aberrant gender constructs about both male and female that exist. So in any case, I've gone on longer than I anticipated, but I'm going to link this Jeff Ford documentary in this podcast, and I hope you take a listen and take a look at it. Again, the documentary is pretty violent, but I can say it's not an exaggeration. It's a pretty accurate portrayal of the neighborhood in which I grew up in, lived in, and dropped and rolled in. The other thing I'd like to mention is there's an organization out of the UK called Oasis Foundation, and there I'm going to link a paper they did on the similarity between radicalization and, in my words, induction into gangs, and the similarity. I think it's an amazing word. Most of the things I put on my podcast are works in progress, so I'll be adding to this podcast like I do others. But in any case, take a look, take a listen. And this is Debra V. Wilson. I am in Winnipeg. It has the hottest summers with the strangest bugs, and then in the winter, we get colder than the surface of Mars. Allah knows this city is bipolar when it comes to weather, but I love it. This is Debra V. Wilson in Winnipeg. Thank you.